for science, consciousness is a mystery. And that's fine that it's a mystery. We don't expect at this point in time to know everything about everything. But to me, this is where some ancient teachings become pertinent.
This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between, or beyond. I'm your host, Edwin Rydberg, and today I'm here with Alistair Conwell. Alistair was born into a Eurasian family in India, but grew up in Western Australia, where he now lives. He has postgraduate degrees in psychology and business communication. Alistair has traveled widely through Britain, Europe, Egypt, the Middle East, Turkey, Taiwan, and the Indian subcontinent. His books and articles have been published internationally, and he's been interviewed by podcasters in the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. Alistair Conwell, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be here, Edwin. Thank you for having me.
So you have degrees in psychology and business. That's interesting. So I'm just curious, sort of, what was your decision process for that, and which one came first as well?
Yeah, and look, that's a good question because I've got 4 degrees. I didn't get them at one go at university. So my first degree was a business degree in business computing. And after completing that, I thought that was it. I'm never going back to university again. Joined the workforce, did work for 3 years, and then decided to do what a lot of young Australians do, and that is to go backpacking. I suppose young people around the world have that idea. And so that's what I wanted to do. And my plan was to be away for a year. So I got on a plane and traveled for some time with a university friend who I'd studied at university, and ended up being away for 3 years because things were going so well, although at times money was very tight. And that's where I did all my travels that you mentioned at the beginning of the show. And during that time, I didn't work in that business computing arena because I tried to get a job in London and I couldn't. And it was great for my ego in that it pricked my ego pretty well. And so when I came back, having been out of the computing industry for 3 years, I didn't want to go back, and it would have been hard for me even if I wanted to. And that's when I got into writing and actually wrote my first book, The Audible Life Stream, and then decided to go back to university. And that's when I did another bachelor's degree in science, majoring in psychology, and then ended up doing an honors degree in psychology, hence the postgrad. And at one point, I was also doing a postgrad in business communication, which was pretty tight. But that's how I ended up getting 4 degrees, 2 in psychology and 2 in business.
So you had the business degrees, and then what was it that sort of inspired you to go into the psychology degrees?
Yeah, and that's because, so I mentioned I ended up coming back from overseas and was inspired to write my first book, The Audible Life Stream, which is a nonfiction book. And in researching that, I was coming across a lot of books written by psychologists because the Audible Life Stream basically is evidence of the spiritual concept called the Audible Life Stream. And it does it from various domains, including quantum physics, including near-death experiences, including out-of-body experiences. And there's a lot of books written by doctors and psychologists who have investigated cases in particular of near-death experiences, hence my interest in psychology. And so I thought, I'd really like to study psychology, and that's what I ended up doing.
One thing I'm curious about, you've studied psychology after studying business. I can see these two being complementary in a way because I mean, business does deal in a lot in psychology, especially with regards to marketing. With that sort of deep knowledge in psychology that you have, does it ever, I mean, normal people like myself in this regard, I get quite depressed looking at the psychology of the business world. Does it ever make you really jaded or bring you down when you look at how it actually works on that sort of public facing scale?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of underhanded things that are done in business, which is very sad. But the actual connection with business and psychology, there is a stream of learning called organizational psychology, which deals more closely aligned, not so much with marketing, but more with human resource development. So it's very much an AI type focus of psychology called organizational psychology. And that's where the whole idea of organizational development comes from as well. But yeah, you're right, particularly when it comes to the big corporations, the multinationals. There's a lot of things that are done that make me and obviously you and many others a bit uncomfortable in terms of how they treat their customers. It's just not good, and it's just not consistent with good psychological practice and mental health well-being. Absolutely.
Right. I was curious of the bad apple syndrome, they call it, because I did take an online course from a university maybe 10 years ago. It was talking about the idea that, okay, we think of, and this relates kind of almost directly to what's happened to the BBC recently. So if you follow that
Sure.
with the whole Trump story, they again go with the bad apple story, which is like, okay, one person takes responsibility for what's happened to this. And in this case, the CEO left. Now she's probably going to get promoted somewhere else, but that's fine. But the course I was taking was saying bad apples don't really arise as a outlier in these situations. They're typically there as part of the culture of these places, right? So it's not actually a bad apple. The culture itself is corrupt within those institutions.
Yes, that's a really good point because the CEO and I think the director of news at the BBC that basically were told to leave. But such senior people, you're right, they are the ones that instill culture throughout an organization because of the positions they hold. So, yes, you're right, there could well be, and obviously I'm here in Australia, thousands of miles away, so I'm not familiar with the BBC, but when such senior people are involved in such behavior, I think it's unlikely that the problem sits solely with those individuals.
But unfortunately, we still have this view of the bad apple, and so it doesn't really get fixed, does it? You'll remove like one person and the culture remains, unfortunately.
And
Yeah.
particularly, the bigger the organization, the more difficult it is to change culture. Just it's almost a physical law, the more people you need to change, the longer it's going to take. And often I found, and this will sound very cynical, but governments and perhaps boards as well, which are, political beasts in their own right, need to be seen to be doing something. And
Hmm.
so they'll act, people will lose their jobs, and, as a way to try and convince the public that, we have addressed the problem. When in fact, there might still be issues in big organizations like that.
Yeah, it's like a tiny band-aid over top of a big cut. Yeah.
Yes.
I do often look at these organizations, whether it's a nation or whether it's a multinational organization or something big like the BBC. We talk about the culture of the entity, but for me, it almost becomes its own being in a way. You can almost view it as each of the people become almost a brain cell within an organism itself, right? So I term it an emergent being, emergent mind. In fact, and I have a book that I've developed about that. I wonder, does that sound completely crazy or does that seem reasonable? Because I mean, we can look at countries, for example, we can say, oh, that country acts this way. And you can predict how a country's going to act. And this kind of goes back to Isaac Asimov's Foundation series in a way where, the historian was he said, oh, I can predict how people will react, but not a person. And that kind of harkens to this as well. And I wonder, does that make sense in any kind of psychological way that you have this, like they become almost entities that have almost a self-protection as well, right? So the entity doesn't want to die. It's trying to preserve its own life in a way as well, which seems very strange.
Yeah, it makes absolute sense because the connectedness of, individuals to communities, whether it be an organization as a communal entity or a nation as a country, there is that connectedness which makes an interrelatedness undeniable. It also, when you were talking, what came to mind is a couple of things. One is, and I forget I think it was an ancient Greek philosopher who said, as above, so below. So the
The Hermetic principles.
principle, yes,
Yeah.
Hermes, so that in the microcosm or the individual, there is the macrocosm, the
Mm.
larger entity. So that's what came to mind, which I think rings true to what you were saying. And also collective unconscious, again, relating to a connection at an unconscious level that individuals have. So I think it absolutely rings true when you consider those two things.
And that's interesting because I was just realizing, and I hadn't thought about it this way before, but framed that way, let's say mass unvetted immigration very, very seriously can be viewed as an attack on that entity in a way. So if you don't have controlled immigration, if you just allow whoever to come in, you have cultures and ideas that that organism is not yet perhaps ready or able to assimilate, let's say.
Yeah.
Does that seem reasonable as well, or am I taking it too far?
I think what you say is true. The dangers is because immigration is such a controversial subject, and Australia's been, I think, guilty of this at some point in its history as well. This demonization of refugees. Of course, countries need to have secure borders, but I think people also need to be treated with dignity and not as criminals when they are seeking asylum. So, it's difficult. You don't want to have one's country's borders overrun, of course not. But I think still people need to be treated with human dignity as well.
Right. And that whole debate will lead us somewhere we don't need to go in this particular interview.
Yes.
But so taking on that theme of travel, let's say, I'll go to your particular travels because you were born in India. First of all, I'm curious, how much time did you spend in India before you moved to Australia and then began your travels?
Yes, I was 5 when my family came to Australia. So I have few memories of India. And indeed, I thought, because I visited India as part of my travels, and I thought, oh, when I visit India, and I was in my mid-20s when I returned to India after the family immigrated. I thought, oh, all these memories would probably come flooding back, but in fact they didn't. But nevertheless, obviously I do have some memories of India, but not so many. And, I've always considered, growing up, all my schooling has been here in Australia, and I've always considered Australia home. So yeah, so I was very young when we came.
When you went back to India, which part did you travel? Did you travel through almost the whole country? I mean, it's a big country, or did you sort of stay in more or less one area?
No, I was lucky enough to travel throughout the country. So I went down in the south through to Tamil Nadu, for example. I went also all the way up north to northwest up into Gujarat, which was great. And then traveled all the way across the north of the country into what's now called Kolkata, which is where I was born, which is on the northeastern side of India. So I did quite a bit of traveling and even went into Nepal, which is north of India, which was fantastic. I didn't do any trekking in the Himalayas though, but it was great because on my mother's side, we actually have a Nepalese connection. And it was really interesting when I was in Nepal in Kathmandu, or little town just out of Kathmandu, a place called Bhaktapur. I remember the locals looking at me and saying, "Oh, are you Nepalese or do you have any Nepalese connection?" And I said, "Yeah, actually, I do." So that was really interesting. And in some ways, Nepal felt more like home than India, which was really interesting. There was just a familiarity there.
Yeah, how far back does that Nepalese connection go then in the family?
So it's on my mother's side. Her father had a secret liaison. So my mother's father, or was it a grandfather? I think it was a father, owned a tea plantation in northern India near Darjeeling, I believe. And as I think is still the case today, a lot of Nepalese people work on these tea plantations. So on my grandfather's tea plantation, he had some of these Nepalese workers, males and females. he had a secret liaison with one of his female Nepalese workers, and that basically created my mother's line of our family. So it was a bit of a no-no, not much said in the family about it, but that's how the Nepalese connection came about.
Yeah, I do suspect that a lot of human lineage has arisen from that type of thing.
Yes, no doubt.
Yeah. So I'm curious on the travels, because you did your traveling, I think, before you went into psychology. Did your travels and the memories of your travels inspire any of your interests later on?
Oh, absolutely. The 3 years I was away backpacking around the world were absolutely pivotal in the trajectory of my life. It basically changed my life and turned it around 180 degrees, no shadow of a doubt. And it changed my perspective and my goals. Very basic level. Before I left Australia to go overseas, I was a reasonably materialistic person. Things started to change before I left Australia when I became interested in meditation. And while overseas, I did a lot of reading, various subjects. I became interested in Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, and stayed at different monasteries, Buddhist monasteries in the UK, for example, deepened my interest in meditation. And it was on my way back to Australia, in Nepal, in Kathmandu. At that point, I'd become vegetarian. So I was in this vegetarian cafe in Kathmandu. And by that stage, I'd actually lost interest in Buddhism in the sense of I didn't want to pursue it. So I was raised as a Catholic, raised as a Christian. In my teenage years, I'd become disillusioned with Catholicism, became interested in Buddhism while I was overseas. But on my way back, the more I found out about Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, the more I saw it as very similar to Christianity in the sense of very ritualistic, and in fact, more ritualistic than Christianity and Catholicism. And that's not what I was looking for. So I was really open to exploring spirituality in a non-religious context. In this vegetarian cafe, I came across these free flies that you often find in cafes, and it talked about this spiritual sound that I haven't heard this concept before. They talked about being able to learn a meditation and tune into the spiritual sound. I was really intrigued. When I came back to Australia, I delved further into that, learned the meditation. That spiritual sound turned out to be what in the West is called the Audible Life stream. Hence, I was motivated to write my first book, The Audible Life Stream, Ancient Secret of Dying While Living, which provides evidence of the spiritual sound. So, that started my trajectory of writing. Haven't gone back to the computing industry ever since. And as I said earlier, studied psychology, went back to university, and the other books followed. So yes, it absolutely was pivotal. It changed me totally.
Yeah, it's interesting because as we'll get into the circadian web, you can see a lot of those themes from your journey coming into that story. So did you write the Audible Life stream sort of more or less very soon after that? You got interested and then did a bunch of research, presumably, and then wrote, and that was sort of the beginning of your writing journey?
Yes, but in fact, I actually tried to write a novel first. So I became interested in writing, and I thought, oh, I'd really like to write a novel with a spiritual theme. And so I started writing this novel, not Circadian Web, but a novel. And it went absolutely nowhere because I had no idea what I was doing. And, I got frustrated. And then one day I thought, oh, maybe I could write an article and maybe get some money that way and see, where it might lead. So I wrote this article about the Audible Live stream and I sold it to a US magazine. I think it was called Yoga International. I don't think it's still published. But anyway, wrote it. It was, sold it to Yoga International. It was published. And I got great feedback, including from someone in America who was on death row I don't know how he got the magazine, but anyway, he wrote back to me and said, "Oh, I really loved the article, really intrigued. I'd love to find out more about the Audible live stream." So at that stage, I hadn't written the Audible live stream, but I put together a package of books on spirituality, etc., and sent them off to him. Sadly, because he was on death row, I got a letter back, not from him, but must have been one of the prison guards or something in the office there, saying so and so's on death row. He's not allowed to receive books because of his situation. So I was really sad, but I was just touched by the feedback I got, including from this prisoner on death row. And that's what made me think about, oh, maybe I could write a book on the Audible live stream, non-fiction rather than fiction. And basically, I took that article, which touched on various points of evidence, and basically just delved deeper into each of those points of evidence in the article and wrote the Audible live stream. So I covered, near-death experiences, quantum physics, out-of-body experiences, scriptural texts from the main religions, and that became the Audible live stream. And that took me 3 years to write, full time, working on it 3 years.
Does make you wonder if how did he get the article if he's not allowed books?
Yeah.
That's strange, isn't it?
Uh, yeah. So I don't know. Maybe the fact that it was a magazine that happened to, be in some cafeteria, that where they eat or something. So it wasn't given to him personally, but somehow it just happened to be there. I don't know.
It's one of those interesting synchronicities of the universe, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
When you're writing, do you have a writing routine? Like, what's your process when you start on a book?
Yeah, that's a great question. What worked for me was identifying the themes that I wanted to explore, and that got me thinking. And then I sort of identified my main characters from the themes. For example, quantum physics is a theme that I explore in Circadian Web. So I've got some characters that are quantum physicists who work at universities, for example. Wanted to explore spirituality, so I've got some religious figures in Circadian Web. And while I personally make a distinction between religion and spirituality, I use religion as a vehicle in the fictional story to explore some of those spiritual themes. And then I found planning the story was really important. So I had a fairly good plan to begin with. But interestingly enough, I deviated from that original plan. So I didn't stick to that plan because I still meditate nowadays each day. What I was finding in the middle of the writing Circadian Web is during my meditation time in the morning, my mind was thinking about the story. I would get ideas for dialogue come to me. And so after my meditation, I'd either quickly, joke those things down on a piece of paper or switch on my laptop and type out the bare bones of the dialogue that came to me. And then it would take the story in areas that I didn't actually anticipate at the beginning, which was fine. I actually found that interesting because things were revealed to me about the characters that I didn't originally envisage. And I like discovering things along the way and going to places that I didn't anticipate. To me, that's what makes the creative process really interesting.
Yeah, I listened to your interview on Inkblot, I believe it was,
Oh,
where
yes,
because I was going to ask the pantser plotter question as well. But it
yes,
sounds like
yes.
your process is somewhat similar to mine, the first novel I
Ah,
drafted back in the day. I think I was probably mostly wanted to be a pantser by personality, but like you say, the book I finished first was partially outlined. Let's say I what I did was I outlined it was for the NaNoWriMo at the time, which is now defunct, unfortunately, but I outlined about 12 to 15 chapters with about a paragraph for
yeah,
each chapter. And then
yeah,
as I was writing, you flesh it out, right? So things develop, but you keep on a
yeah.
kind of roadmap. And then for in my case, what I realized was I needed a lot more content. So I got to a certain point where I had to wing like about 5 or 6 chapters in the middle, right? So characters were just coming in and new stuff happening. It's interesting when the brain's under pressure or super interested in what you're writing, where it goes.
Yeah, exactly. I really find that interesting myself too.
So you are published now by Roundfire Books. Is that
Yep.
right? Is that all of your books have published by them or?
All of my books are published by a company called Collective Inc. And Round Fire Books is an imprint. It's one
Okay.
of their fiction imprints. My non-fiction books are also published by Collective Inc., although they were called O Books when my non-fiction books were published, but they are published under different imprints. So Collective Inc. has a number of non-fiction and fiction imprints. So yes, it's basically the one publisher, but under different imprints.
Right. And have they been a good publisher? What's your experience with them been like?
Yeah, no, they have been good, and the deadlines have been met as they said they would. So yeah, look, and what makes them different, I find, from other publishers is they actually get back to authors very quickly. I found, because I should say it, while it took me 3 years to write my first nonfiction book, The Audible Life Stream, it took me 10 years to find a publisher.
Wow. Okay.
And I think, that's just, bonkers, as we say in Australia. What kept me going was shortly after I finished the manuscript for the Audible Live Stream, a US publisher called New Falcon Publications, which I don't think exists anymore, actually offered me a contract. And I thought, fantastic. Obviously, I've written something that's publishable if a publisher wants to give me a contract. The contract, though, I didn't like because they wanted me to put some money up front. And it was actually quite a bit of money, which at the time I didn't have anyway. And so I said, thanks, but no thanks. But it was encouraging to at least for them to offer me a contract, even one I didn't like, or the terms of which I didn't like. And then also along the way, there were other publishers who rejected the manuscript, but, and I got plenty of standard rejection letters, let me tell you. But every so often, I'd get a really good rejection letter, if such a thing exists, where it was clear they liked the manuscript. And one even said, love the manuscript. It's a book that has to be published, but we're not the publisher for it. But please, pursue other publishers. And one even gave me a name of an agent in the US who I ended up contacting. In the end, they weren't interested, but nevertheless, I was still getting this positive feedback, even though it was being rejected. That kept me going. I was convinced that what I had written was publishable. I just had to find the right publisher. And after 10 years, I finally found Collective Inc. And as I mentioned, they actually, rather than most publishers taking 3, 6, 8 months to get back to an author, they get back to authors literally in a matter of weeks if
Wow.
they
Okay.
are interested in publishing a book. So they move much quicker than other publishers, which is great.
Yeah, that's excellent. So the question I usually end this part of the discussion with is all around marketing. So how has that process been? Has the publisher been quite good for that? And presumably, I mean, you went into your writing initially with a strong drive to sell it and promote it. So you had in mind a bit of a marketing mindset already. And then you did have a business background, although it was business computing. So I'm curious whether that helped at all as well.
Well, my postgraduate degree in business is in public relations, which is a
Okay, even
marketing
better. Yeah.
major. Look, marketing, and I think it's an experience for all of us, is like swimming against the tide. Particularly now with the ability for people to self-publish. There literally, I imagine, thousands, if not tens of thousands of books coming online probably every day. And so, I'm finding trying to get some headway, like I imagine many other authors, other than the really big names who are backed by the big publishers with huge marketing machines, it's really difficult. So, my publisher has been able to secure a couple of interviews, including your one, which is great. And I've been able to secure 2 or 3 interviews here in Australia, which has also been good. But I would have loved more, just to get that headway. And I tried contacting podcasters all over the place. Very few even got back to me. So it's hard work, absolutely hard work.
It's interesting. And with podcasters, one of the things I've learned is you can search because I work with other authors as well, and
Yeah.
you can search them out, but then a lot of podcasts don't last very long.
Oh,
It's a
okay.
you'll find a podcast that's like, oh, that looks like a perfect fit, and then they only have 20 episodes, and the last episode was like a year ago, right? So so
Yes,
they've kind of
yes, I've come
stopped.
across that.
That's kind of unfortunate, yeah. And then of course it's
Yeah,
the money part of it, isn't it? Like you said, you want to get on to like the morning talk shows and stuff, but only that's kind of reserved for big money guests, sort of,
exactly.
yeah, money guests backed by big money, I guess you'd say. So,
Exactly.
yeah. Do you have anything that you feel has sort of moved the needle at all, or is it still sort of in process in regards to your marketing?
Yeah, look, I tell myself it's still early days because the book was released worldwide, what, I think in August this year. So, what, about 3, 4 months ago. And then in Australia, it was only released this month. I was hopeful because I spent quite a bit of time. I don't know if you've seen the book trailers. I made 3 book trailers, which I was really chuffed and proud of,
Those
and
are
I've
on your
got great
YouTube.
feedback. Yeah. And in fact, so I did some Facebook advertising, and I was so pleased that I got over 8,000 likes on one of my trailers. And I thought, fantastic. Hopefully that will really raise awareness of the book. And so, and I target the advertising to America, which is my where I sell most of my books anyway. But America, the UK, Canada, France, because you would know I've got some French characters in my book, or Ireland, another big internet English market. And as I say, over 8,000 likes, and I thought fantastic, but it doesn't seem to have, not yet anyway, been translated into a jump in sales that I can see. So that's been surprising, given that people have liked at least the one book trailer.
Yeah, social media is one of those tricky things with regards to selling, isn't
Yeah.
it? I was curious, well, first off, with your trailers, what was your process for making those? Did you stitch the parts together yourself, or did you happen to use AI or anything?
No, did everything myself. The only thing that I believe AI was used, and I used a product called Canva,
Okay,
which
right.
is very easy to use and great. I found images and videos just doing searching on the net to find relevant sites. The only AI element I used was for the voiceovers, and that was because the voiceover or the script, two elements to the script. One was basically the back cover blurb for the book at the beginning, and then in some of the videos I use pieces of dialogue from the story, and so they're male and female characters that are speaking. And in the third video I've used, which is the one that got over 8,000 likes on Facebook, I used some dialogue from one of my female French characters. So I found this site that you just basically type in text you want read out, and you can use the tone of voice and the accent, which is great. So I was able to find a female French voice for that part of the video. So I was pretty sure that those voices are kind of AI generated. So that was the only AI element to the videos that I used.
Right, excellent. I was curious whether you intend to expand your YouTube channel, because one of the things that I was kind of hoping to see, to be honest, when I went there, was some short discussions on some of the themes in your books. Have you ever thought of expanding into that, like doing 5 or 10 minute discussions on sort of very narrow topics?
Look, that's a really good point. I have sort of thought about it, but not to any great extent, to be honest. I'm, to be honest, it kind of makes me feel a little uncomfortable being on, almost on show. But look, I don't rule it out. Maybe I like to almost be in the background, a bit of an introvert or largely introverted in that respect. But who knows? Who knows?
I suppose one thing you could do, I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can make YouTube videos these days. One thing you could do is, like with the trailer, right? Stock video, etc., and then use your voice as a voiceover. And so you read a prepared, like a script, you write out a sort of 5 minute script and then read that over the video or something. I mean, you could use AI, but I think people are definitely noticing AI a lot these days, AI voices.
Yeah,
And so the authenticity of a real person is starting, I think, to become a significant thing again. So I think we should get on to your book actually now.
sure.
So the Circadian Web, the Space of Time. So very briefly, this is a story told in four parts in four different timelines. Now we'll get into some of the themes and ideas in the story. These timelines are a few selected times through the future where you highlight different socio-political situations within that. Well, I won't go too much because we're conscious of spoilers. So I wanted, maybe you can, if you want to add anything to that description that sort of fleshes it out, that's spoiler safe, go for it.
Okay, so I tell people it's about four men with subconscious secrets on seemingly disconnected timelines and mysterious women who are intent on either helping them or pushing them down the rabbit hole.
Right. And that's interesting because that is a major feature of the story. One of the things that comes out is also that I found interesting was you highlight power dynamics. There's a number of themes within the story, but one of them is clearly the power dynamics. And you mentioned in your own history backgrounds within the Catholic Church and within Buddhism, which both come out in the story. I don't know. I'm curious if it's safe to say that your journey through life has maybe given you a negative perspective on the power structures of a religion, but not necessarily spirituality. I think because my impression is that you would be quite spiritual, but perhaps, let's say, at least very questioning of the institutions of the religions. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I think that's a good summation because yes, I'm deeply invested in spirituality. Hence, as I mentioned earlier, I meditate each day as part of my spiritual practice. And I also mentioned that, I make a distinction between religion and spirituality. And one of the reasons I became disillusioned with religion is because of that power dynamic, which you rightly point out. That power dynamic, is just not, I didn't want to just explore it in that religious context. So you may be aware that it's explored in other contexts as well. Because to me, it's fundamental to basically our social structures and even our cultural fabric. We're always hearing, and I'm a bit of a news junkie, about power being abused in whatever context, whether it's in Australia, sadly, we've recently had a spate of childcare workers abusing children, absolutely horrific. But to me, there's again that power dynamic being abused. So, it is hard not to include that exploration of power and the abuse of power in the story. I hope it makes for an interesting read, but I also hope it kind of rings true to the story because, as I say, we're often hearing of stories where power is being abused in various contexts. So, as an author, I think it's a rich vein to explore.
You do seem to focus on one particular abuse, but what's interesting to me is you've mentioned the main male characters and then the female characters of different types of female characters. We can't go into too much without some spoilers there. But the interesting thing with regards to the power structures to me is okay, you have most of the, let's say, overt abuses that occur are males leading the power structure. But the interesting thing with the women I found, and I think this is realistic, and I think you do it justice within the stories, you've got several types of women within that power structure. And you have those women who seem to be invested in that power structure and even let's say happy to help support that version of the power structure. Then you have those who kind of are what I would call resigned victims. So you have the first kind of are complicit, then you have the resigned victims who who don't necessarily agree with the power structure, but they go along with it because they think, okay, that's just the way the world is, or I can't do anything about it. And then you do have what I call the rebellious victims, which are the ones that, okay, this is clearly wrong and you have to do something about it, kind of thing. And I find that that was I think a realistic exploration of that feature. Just curious how you went about developing that, because that did feature in pretty much throughout each time frame as well. Uh,
Yeah. Look, I'm really glad you see the nuance in that because it is very nuanced. And one of the ways that I handled it was almost not directly, which I think helped with the nuancing. And that was with my characters. I wanted to give, my main characters, I wanted to give them agency. And so I wanted to give them specific goals that they wanted to achieve. And so by doing that, I think it builds in that nuance that you refer to, because to achieve their goal, they will do certain things and perhaps ignore certain things because they've got this goal in mind. And so I think that helped in an indirect way. So not necessarily consciously or in a contrived way, but more nuanced and natural and believable ways to explore that power dynamic.
I'm curious that did you build that into your background characters as well? So some of the lesser characters, because like I said, with the female character specifically, you did have this nuance of a variety of kinds. And I could see how you could have done that with like you described. I was just wondering, was that a conscious process for those characters also?
To a certain extent, depending on what roles they had in the story.
Because for
Um,
me, it was the Buddhist segment, let's say, was the part that sort of highlighted this the most obviously in a way.
yes, without revealing
Not going too
any
much.
spoilers. And I think that is probably a good example where in that timeline, although I suppose it's true for the other timelines as well, there's that hidden goal that particular characters have, which isn't revealed till later in the story, that colors the decisions they make.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah. I was curious. So you did pick four locations and four times within the story, and you feature different aspects of society in different spatial temporal realms, let's say. But how did you go about choosing those particular ones?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So, I wanted to write a sort of a time travel science fiction type story, basing it in Australia, or, two of the timelines, as you know, are in Australia purely for convenience, I suppose, living in Australia. The third and fourth timelines, one is in America, futuristic America, and then one is a futuristic Taiwan. To me, America is very interesting at the moment, probably for all the wrong reasons. America, largest economy in the world, biggest military in the world for the time being. China is catching up very quickly. So geopolitically, socially, environmentally, even given that in the White House there are climate change deniers there at the moment. Very interesting. Interesting from a fictional context to write about what a future America may look like. Taiwan is interesting because of the geopolitical situation that it's in at the moment. China wants to have, believes it's their territory, and it certainly has historical links to it. And I've been to Taiwan a couple of times on meditation retreats. So it's also a reasonably familiar country to me. And because I went on meditation retreats there, and I'm exploring themes about religion and spirituality, having a timeline in a futuristic Taiwan in a Buddhist monastery also is reasonably familiar for me. Even though it wasn't a Buddhist monastery I stayed in when I visited Taiwan on my two trips there, it was a monastery setup, but it wasn't aligned with any religion. So again, some familiarity there, but also interesting geopolitically.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And something else in relation to the four timelines that was apparent in the story was, and perhaps you can speak to your own perspectives on this, but you featured, and tell me also if this is a spoiler or not, but you did feature, as we mentioned, Buddhism, Christianity in one, and then you had a sort of science segment as well, or science realm. But in each case, there's examples. Let's say they become, how I want to say, institutional, rigorous in their thinking, hierarchical. And I think that they came across kind of in all three, which is realistic because you see that in science these days as well. It's fairly obvious in what we've encountered in the last 5 to 10 years. And as I mentioned earlier, you have like the people who are at the top of the hierarchy. You have those who are complicit in helping them maintain this hierarchy. And then you have those resign who know how the abuses but are resigned to staying within the hierarchy, and those who rebel against it. Ultimately, the interesting ones to me are those. It seems like what these are selling is hope, effectively, like these three groups in a way. And they're selling hope to those who, maybe this is too harsh to phrase it, but might be too insecure to develop those ideas themselves and to have faith in their own views. Is that a reasonable way of interpreting this? Because I do see like the hierarchical structures often do that. And not, it's not always like, not everyone involved in them is in this hopeless or lazy. Some people have genuine experiences that encourage them to be within those systems, but ultimately they don't need to be within that system. That they could create their own system, their own, they could take, like undoubtedly you have your experiences in the world and form your own views. But a lot of people choose to be part of these structures. And just maybe you can speak to your thoughts on why that is.
What a fantastic question, Edwin. I think there's an element of truth to what you say about, I would probably couch it in terms of convenience. The structures provide a convenient way to formulate not only hope, but I would suggest belief systems. And, hope is, I think, a part of that. And while I see a role for religion for certain people, because I think for some, maybe many, religion does meet their needs for where they are at that time. And I think all institutions are like that in a way. It's like, for example, we might work in a job for X number of years, but then we find it's no longer fulfilling for us. So we look for another job, we go to another organization or change careers or whatever, make some change. But for that period of time we were with that employer, hopefully for the most part, it fulfilled our needs, whether it be economic or personal. And so I think it's true for even religious organizations that at any given time, hopefully it's fulfilling the needs for at least most of those people at that time. But that's not to say at some future point, some of those people will think, well, and I'm basing this on my own personal experience, having been a Catholic and a Christian, and I didn't take refuge in the Buddha, but I was very interested in Buddhism for a while. And for those times, it was interesting and I was getting something out of it. But then there came a time in both cases where I thought, no, there's something more I'm looking for. And that's what prompted me to, further investigate spirituality. So I agree with you to an extent. And I think I'm including hope, but also talk about the convenience of these institutions providing belief systems for people. So hopefully it's meeting their needs at any given time.
So kind of a guiding life framework in a way.
Yeah,
Yeah, that kind of structure. Yeah. Yeah, it's
yeah.
interesting because you've come at it sort of from the, so just in relation to your story and the sort of three fragments we said you experienced, and you have the science background as well, but you said you come at sort of Christian, Buddhism, and then spiritual. My own sort of pathway, I guess, is, when I was young, of course, North America was, we go to church, right? So Christian background as well. Now I realized sort of when I was 12 that there was something I didn't quite jive with there. And so for me, mine went sort of into science for quite a long time, and fairly, what you'd look at it from the outside and you'd say like the doctrine of science, right? Because obviously science has difficulty approaching certain subjects, and so you just kind of talk around them when you're in science, right? And then so I have then moved in the last 5 to 10 years much more into the spiritual realm as well. So that's sort of been
Okay.
my process.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So you do have some technology in your story. We like to go into technology a little bit. And so the first one I wanted to mention is the AI implants, because there's parallels with the last book we just discussed in the previous episode, which is Chris PR. So this is a futuristic story, and at the time of recording, that one's not available yet, so you wouldn't have seen it. But
Okay.
what the interesting similarity is, so these are AI implants,
Ah,
and in both cases with the authors, you've both come at it from the view of the implant being quite annoying, to be honest, to the main character, right? So,
really? Okay.
so you're
We
you're
didn't collude. Let me say that
no,
from the
no,
beginning.
no. The stories are completely different, but it's interesting that this seems to be
Yeah.
maybe part of the zeitgeist, right? Maybe inspired by Neuralink, getting closer to reality or something.
Yes,
But
yes.
but yeah, so that's an interesting, because a lot of times the best case scenario we think, oh well, we'll have AI implants and we can do all this stuff and we connect all of this stuff. And we don't really think of the intrusiveness of this. And so I was just curious. So, what was your developmental process in bringing this segment into the story? So, the implants would seem to be a natural extension of what's happening,
Yes.
but then to make it not only annoying, but controlling as well. So, maybe you
Yeah.
can speak to that.
Yeah, another great question. Like any technology, there is an upside and the downside. And, everyone has a mobile phone nowadays, except I must be one of the few people on the planet that don't. I refuse to have a mobile phone because I find it very intrusive, annoying. Not that I've ever owned one. And so, from a fictional point of view, to make an interesting story, rather than have everyone being happy campers, one has to create some conflict and tension. And to me, to envisage futuristic technology like a neural implant and think everything's going to be swimmingly, I think would make for a less interesting story. And so I gave the neural implant Ebis, which has a female voice, but I treated that implant just like another character with its own agency, its own goal. And it's just as a voice in Marvin's head that makes decisions sometimes without telling him, which is where some of the annoyance is created because it has its own agency. It's just like another character. It just happens to be connected to his brain through his spinal cord. And to me, that just made for a more interesting story, and I hope provides some funny elements as well. So for me, it just made for a more interesting story by creating some conflict and not really knowing where that relationship between Marvin and the neural implant is really going to go.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just was thinking as you're describing that it almost felt like a mentally conjoined twin in a way or something, another
Yeah,
mind in your head that can sort of take over control when it feels like, kind of thing, which is a bit
exactly.
frightening.
How annoying would that be? Personally, I
Very,
would find
yeah.
that really annoying.
Yeah.
While from a technological perspective, having that neural impact means you don't need a phone anymore. You don't need a computer or laptop or whatever. It does everything for you. On the face of it, you think, wow, fantastic. But think about the downsides, and that's what I did. So, yeah, as I say, hopefully it makes for a more interesting read.
Yeah, well, it's like you say with the phones. I mean, I'm not a super fan of them. I like being able to search stuff. I don't like social media. I don't even like using it as a phone, to be honest. But there's the idea that at least you can put it down and put it away. But if it's implanted in your head, you can't really do that. There's no off switch. You're kind of
Exactly.
stuck. Yeah. I'm very
Yeah.
curious, you not having a phone. Well, first of all of our countries are going digital ID, which is going to make things very difficult for those who don't have the phones. And then I guess the thing that came to mind was, because more and more you see people Whenever they get even slightly bored, they go on their phone. And so this must be a
Absolutely.
very strange experience for you being in any kind of public situation when people they just start going down to their phone, right?
Well, I observe it all the time. And an example I often use when this idea of me not having a phone comes up is whenever I pass like a restaurant or cafe when I'm just walking, doing shopping or whatever, it's almost inevitable I'll see people sitting at a table facing each other, but they're not talking. They're both on
Yeah,
their phones.
yeah,
In theory, these phones should make us more connected. And on one level, they do. And they serve an important purpose, say for an emergency if something arises. But I think in some ways, they're also making us less connected, actually, truly connected, because we can be with people physically, but not be with them psychologically or mentally because we're invested in the phone, mentally invested in our phones. And that's one of the reasons I don't, is to me, it's a distraction, a mobile phone.
yeah.
And I'm always getting ideas for stories and things like that. And I think one of the reasons is like when I'm riding my electric mountain bike or something, and one of the reasons is I'm not distracted by technology. It means I'm more open to ideas, and obviously I'm speaking from personal experience. So yeah, that's another reason yeah, the thought of a phone just
Yeah, I
creates,
find it what you said with distraction and ideas. It is interesting because I do collect ideas from a lot of the stuff I watch and see. But the
uh,
interesting thing is that the brain seems to best assimilate them in those quiet periods, right? Like in the shower or something, or like I say, mountain biking or something, right? That's when the
yeah.
brain seems to put this stuff together and sort of share it with you.
Exactly. To me, that's when one is true in those quiet moments, or when one's not actually thinking about being creative. I think that's when one is more open to creative inspiration. So for me, the less involved and distracted with technology, from my perspective, the better.
It's going to be an interesting world in 5 to 10 years to see how this sort of splits society in a way, because we will have the heavy adopters and then we will have those who, as much as they can, try to resist that as well. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. In this AI segment you have with the implant, it's interesting because it actually, you might be familiar with David Icke, most people are.
Yeah.
It brings to mind some of the things he talks about because
Okay.
the AI, again, hopefully not spoilers, but it literally obstructs his connection to a higher awareness in that segment, right?
Okay.
And that's the kind of thing that David Icke tends to bring in is that, it's we have this higher, I mean, he does a lot of stuff and people might not agree with a lot of what he's saying, but he does talk about the idea of control through the AI and locking us into a system where we're detached from our real, true identities and essence. And this segment, let's say, with the AI in your story, really kind of what I felt was a sort of literal vision of that as it stopped him from, as much as it could, from sort of connecting with something broader and deeper. Was that brought in intentionally, or is it just the way the AI developed as a controlling entity?
Yes, it wasn't conscious. And while I'm aware of David, I can honestly say I've never watched any of his videos. For me, it was more just about creating that tension and that conflict between the Ibis, the AI character, and Marvin. That was the focus, as opposed to a bigger thought about obstruction to something higher. To be frank, it was more focusing on, yes, technology has advantages, but there's that saying in science, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There is a downside as well. And it's like any character, even putting aside the AI issue, characters have good traits and bad traits. We all do in real life. And so again, I was more focused on creating credible, hopefully three-dimensional characters that have good traits and positive traits. And the AI character, I treated just like any other. That was my thinking around that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's very true that every technology is kind of a double-edged sword. I think there's the American economist Thomas Sowell who puts it as, well, it's a general statement that applies to a lot of areas, but it says there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. I think that's the kind of thing you see very obviously with technology, and especially as technology gets higher and higher and more intrusive in our lives, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting quote from that economist. The other thing you made me think of when you mentioned that quote is the unintended consequences that can occur. The things that a so-called solution, in inverted commas, doesn't envisage. And in policy, there's always that risk, particularly strategic macroeconomic policy or even non-economic, just any sort of policy. There's that risk of unintended consequences, which are always there.
Yeah, and for positive or negative,
Yeah,
sci-fi author Cory Doctorow loves to use the idea that when we write science fiction, it's very difficult for us to like we'll explore an idea and we'll take like the first degree consequences, and maybe we'll be able to imagine second degree consequences, but it's almost impossible for us to imagine, third and fourth degree consequences, which end up happening in the world. But, the
yes,
extrapolation, because there's just too many variables, I think, at that point.
exactly. That's so true. Exactly.
So, keeping with your theme from the Audible Life stream, there is the idea of sound and consciousness within the circadian web. And you asked me before the interview not to go into the specifics of the technology, but you do use this kind of thing. That was presumably intentional, feeding off of your past interests. So what was the developmental process that to led to the incorporation into the story? And then I must say that the way it developed in the end was unexpected, the way you went as there as well. But I won't say any more on that.
Sure. Well, I'm glad to hear you found it unexpected because I do want to surprise my readers. And so I'll focus on consciousness because to me, for science, and I've been interested in consciousness, for years, decades. To me, that's the most interesting aspect because for science, consciousness is a mystery. And that's fine that it's a mystery. We don't expect at this point in time to know everything about everything. But to me, this is where some ancient teachings become pertinent. What I find really interesting, and this is where my interest in quantum physics has developed. While consciousness is a mystery, what I found most interesting is that string theory, which is a theory in quantum physics, you may be aware, is wholly consistent with the ancient spiritual teachings of the Audible Life stream. And that's what I find really interesting because it brings two domains which have historically been poles apart, science and spirituality, or specifically mysticism. It brings them together in this concept. They use different names, but essentially it's the same concept. So quantum physics talks about superstrings, whereas ancient mystical teachings talk about, at least in the West, it's referred to as the audible life stream. And that's what I really wanted to explore in Circadian Web. And you're right, it's a common theme in my previous books as well. Being able to explore a mystery like consciousness, I find really fascinating. And I'm sure any books I write in the future, that'll be a central theme as well, because it's just fascinating. Consciousness is riveting in that we can explore what it is or what it isn't, because, science certainly doesn't know what it is.
It is interesting more and more these days with regards to consciousness, especially. It's interesting to think that, it's quantum physicists that are probably more interested in and perhaps closer to unraveling the nature of consciousness than, for example, biologists would be, right? I do find it interesting that, as you say, as physicists explore sort of and expand the boundaries of what they're thinking about and what our knowledge is, whether it's the universe or whether it's the mind, they do seem to come closer and closer to concepts that were expressed in ancient spirituality in many areas. And they won't admit it necessarily, because I saw something else recently regarding, how are we existing basically? If, based on the observer principle, why do we exist then? And you can come up with an answer for that they won't like necessarily. But,
Yeah.
so there's all these kind of questions that you get to a point and they will refuse to make that connection. But like we're saying here, the connection seems to be relatively apparent between their theories and the ancient spiritual ideas as well, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And, there could be a number of reasons why they don't want to overtly make that connection. And for some, it could be for the sake of their profession. They might be laughed at, or it might curtail their career opportunities as well. So that's perfectly understandable. But yeah, there are some people like Donald Hoffman. Have you heard or seen any of his?
The name's familiar, but I can't place anything.
Yeah, he's an American physicist, and he has produced some great YouTube videos about his theories of consciousness, which again, I find wholly consistent with ancient spiritual teachings. I can't recall, I'm not sure he explicitly states that. In fact, I'm pretty sure he doesn't, but nevertheless, he's a great communicator in at least being open to push the boundaries of science, and is open-minded, because I think the problem I have with mainstream science is the closed-mindedness, to the point of almost being arrogant, because their beliefs are almost based on the premise that we already know everything there is to know. And they'll try and squeeze concepts or ideas into this four-dimensional paradigm that we live in. And anything that is outside that is either debunked, not even considered. And to me, that's being closed-mindedness, and is in fact, I think, in my view, against scientific principles and rigor. Because I think one still needs to be open-minded.
Yeah, no, I do agree. And it's interesting because I think this is an issue that science comes up against regularly as it develops. It'll reach a point. So I almost, you almost envision it as the paradigm shift curve, where you have a whole bunch of experiments being done and there's a huge increase in knowledge and science. And then you reach a point where it feels like it's slowing down. I mean, I don't know if it is slowing down, but it feels like in some ways it comes up against a bit of a wall. Like this happened in the 80s as well, where I think Scientific American published an article like the end of science, basically, right? Right before everything changed again. So they reach a point where it looks like things are slowing down. And so they feel like, okay, we know everything, and then it takes off again, right? Oh, it just needs a paradigm shift in thinking, and all of a sudden everything opens up again. And then that's even just ignoring the institutionalization of science as well, which, as we
Yes,
discussed earlier, creates a culture, exactly as we were saying, where you kind of don't want to step out of the boundaries of the beliefs of that culture because you get ostracized from it. And that's very real. It's happened many times. And it's
yeah,
sad because that's not inherently what science is supposed to be, but
exactly.
it does become that way when you institutionalize it. Yeah. And like everything else, right? Like religion as well, as we've said.
Exactly.
It's kind of sad. Yeah. So, so I wanted to bring up an idea that I had. So you, with your technology, you sort of feeds into the sound aspect of your Audible live stream. Now, perhaps you can summarize the Audible live stream before we go on, because I don't think we've really discussed it, and it might sort of help
Mm.
the framework of this bit.
Yeah, sure. So the concept of the audible live stream is basically it's a spiritual sound or vibration that can be actually perceived by by us, but not through our physical ears. It can only be tuned into within silence. Hence the whole meditation practice about being able to tune into it. And why is the Audible live stream important? And that's because it's basically the basis of all reality. The belief is that all the different levels of consciousness and the different dimensions in the universe are held together by this spiritual vibration called the Audible live stream. In Eastern mysticism, it has various different names. In ancient Greek, it was referred to as the Logos, for example. So that's why it's important. It's basically the fundamental nature of reality. And that's exactly what superstrings are, the quantum physics theory. So that's the Audible live stream and why it's considered important.
It's interesting as well because I've begun looking again in the older spiritual stuff and the Gnostics' perspective on, let's say, God and the universe with the monad, essentially the universe existing from the vibrational emanations of this being effectively, which does speak to that kind of thing. Because I mean, sound is basically vibrations, which is really interesting. I also find it interesting.
Absolutely.
I did mention binaural frequencies earlier, and I find it interesting with that, the link being perhaps that you can perceive frequencies lower than our ears can hear when you do that. You put in two different frequencies in each ear, and our ears sort of are what we respond to something like 20 hertz, I think, is more or less the lowest frequency. I think it's somewhere around there. But if you put in two sounds, one in each ear, that's, let's say, 20 hertz and 24 hertz, then you can perceive 4 hertz, the difference between the frequencies, which is very strange, right? There's something different going on there. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Well, my understanding with binaural frequencies is that, as you were saying, you can put in two different tones into each ear, and the brain creates a tone between the two tones that are being input into the ear. It's a concept. Have you heard of Robert Monroe, the guy who's kind of the pioneer for out-of-body experiences?
Again, sounds familiar. I can't place it at the
Yeah,
moment. Yeah, I probably have come
yeah,
across
that's
him in
okay.
readings.
Interestingly enough, only was it today or yesterday, I came across an old YouTube video where he was interviewed. But anyway, he was an engineer by profession, and he started investigating these, being able to input different tones. And I think he set up the Monroe Institute, I think in Virginia in the US. But I think he trademarked this concept known as hemisync, which means hemisphere synchronization. So brain hemisphere synchronization because of, based on this concept of binaural frequencies. And his theory is that different tones can induce altered states of consciousness. So I think the research is still going on to basically induce out of body experiences depending on what tones. And just as a side note, out of interest was or is the CIA in America were at one point, and who knows, may still well be, very interested in what the Monroe Institute was doing. They saw and may still well see value in it for their own purposes.
Yeah, that I
Say
think
no.
the Stargate project, I think, was one of the projects the CIA was involved with. Yeah, sort of remote
Oh, really? I
viewing and
didn't know
things like
that.
that.
Okay.
And that kind of leads me
Right.
into what I was going to share, which is, so I went looking for, because I've had long the idea that if we're sort of quantum fields, or at least described by a quantum wave function, then why can we not modify ourselves by consciousness, right? Whether it's healing or whether it's like literally teleportation. So I went working with the AI to ask it, could you develop, let's say, a room-sized Stargate to be able to transport yourself wherever you want? And of course, it came back with, there's all kinds of physics issues. We need new physics and stuff. So I said, well, what if we assume the universe is a holographic universe? And that opened up all kinds of possibilities. And something it came up with very quickly was the concept of an AI enhanced consciousness amplifier. And then I did a Google check to see if that was something that was in discussion somewhere. I didn't find anything.
Yeah.
So I started asking it a bunch of questions, and it initially started talking about, oh, you could use Neuralink and stuff like that. But then I said, well, could you do it without some of these technologies that are still being developed? So it took it to the idea that you could use one of these off-the-shelf brainwave sensors and connect that to an AI sound generator and trigger it so that you can enhance certain brain waves. So when you're meditating, for example, you have certain brainwave state, and the music or sounds it could generate would allow you to enhance that meditative state. And so that was an interesting exploration. I put some of this on my blog on Substack, but I think maybe I'll go and inspired by this episode, I'll put the full discussion on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an
Well,
interesting thing, and I haven't tried it out yet to create this thing, but you could put it together with some of the AI stuff that exists and some of the technology that exists now and give it a try and be interested to see
yeah,
if it works.
you could be on a gold mine there.
Yeah, I'd be really
Yeah, I
curious to
mean,
see if it works.
yeah, because I know for several years now, there's companies that produce CDs and music to assist people in meditation, that
Right.
ambient new age stuff as well. What you're describing perhaps just takes it a bit deeper into the next level. So yeah, who knows? That something you alluded to just now was about if we exist as quantum fields, then why can't we heal and things like that? And I think the potential is there, is just getting the right technology, the right know-how to be able to do that.
Yeah. It seems like it should be, unless we're missing something else in our understanding, of course. But yeah, no,
Yeah,
I'd be interesting
maybe.
and definitely, and there are people who claim you can, so maybe they're right.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're getting towards the end. As I mentioned, the end of your book took an interesting turn, which made it feel to me like you left it open for a series. I think you have been asked this before, but are you thinking of a series? Do you have anything in mind in that regard?
I have thought of a series and I've made a few notes for at least a sequel because, yes, I did end it in such a way that it's a great leaping point to take the story elsewhere and perhaps elsewhen, if I could put it that way. So, yes, I'm certainly open to that. But I've also got ideas for other books as well. And who knows? I've not committed to anything. I haven't put any timelines on anything. I tend to bring out a book every few years, so it might be several years before I even put something out. Who knows? But, I was inspired to write Circadian Web, and once I got going, the momentum was fantastic. I just couldn't stop, basically. But yeah, so I'm still jotting down ideas, just like, I started with Circadian Web. It was just about jotting down ideas. And after a few weeks, I was getting into a story and mapping out characters. And so who knows? I might wake up tomorrow morning after this interview and decide, wow, Edwin's given me some really good ideas after that interview. Who knows? But yes, you're right. There is the potential for at least one other book in the Circadian Web
The interesting thing
world.
with the framework you've put in place in the Circadian Web is, in theory, you could write standalone novels that are still set within the same universal framework. And then you could, if you felt like it, try to tie them together at some future date as well.
It's very perceptive of you to say that because that's exactly how I see it as well. And yeah, I won't say any more because we don't want to give any spoilers away.
Yeah, exactly.
But you're right, there is what's the word? There's a adaptability to some of the plot devices which can easily be used in other fictional contexts.
Right.
I'll keep that as
Yeah.
cryptically as possible.
Excellent. So as I mentioned, I think we're drawing to the end. So I got two big questions to hit you with, and then we'll let you plug your stuff. So the first one is, with your experience and professional background, so speaking to your psychology and business background, what's your interpretation of the chaos of the modern world? How would you interpret that? Perhaps it's its development, its current status, where it's going, whatever you feel to chip in on that, because I know it's incredibly complex.
Yeah, it is. That is a huge question. I have concerns, to be honest. When you consider there seems to be this confluence of some really big issues at the moment: geopolitical, environmental with climate change. And when I say geopolitical, we've got a US president that is really creating a lot of chaos in the world because he does things differently. You've got an increasingly aggressive leaders in the Far East and also in Europe. So you've got AI. How can I forget AI? Combining that with robotics. You've got developments in quantum computing, which, quantum computing, AI, certainly some benefits there. But as we were discussing earlier, what are the downsides? What are the unintended potential risks, unintended consequences? So I have concerns about where we're at the moment for all those reasons and all those big issues. As we're seeing almost every day on the news, we're seeing some 1 in 100 year event, climate catastrophe, environmental weather catastrophe happening somewhere in the world, including Australia. So, things are really ramping up on many levels at the moment. So, yeah, I have concerns.
Yeah, it is like we're reaching the technological singularity, not necessarily predicting a self-aware AI, but definitely, like you say, the confluence of all these technologies coming together will bring us to a point where we can't necessarily see what the world is going to be like on the other side of that. And I think that's actually ahead of schedule according to the predictions, but I think it's probably because our window has been refined. But yeah, it'll be interesting. So the last question then, speaking more to your interests in writing and your personal interests, is how do you see the human experience in a world where we have a greater understanding of meaningful spirituality, the quantum universe, and our own true nature? So like we took you to the worst case scenario in the first question and perhaps the best case scenario that you could see in this question.
What a question. So, how you see humans
The
experiencing?
human experience in general in a world where we have a greater understanding of meaningful spirituality.
Oh, okay. I think the potential, because of that greater understanding, there's the potential to deepen that spirituality. It's a choice we can make, despite all the influence of technology and the potential distractions that technology can deliver. It doesn't remove the choice that we have to deepen at least our sense of spirituality. I think that will always be there because my view is that we are all inherently spiritual. So it's our nature. So no matter what's happening in the physical world, while it can distract us and deceive us by creating these illusions, it doesn't change the fact that we are all inherently spiritual. So, we all have the choice to deepen that spirituality, particularly as you allude to, the knowledge and the thinking is there. It's just about being able to find it and discern it and go deeper into it.
Do you think if a significant percentage of the population sort of tuned into that spirituality, that perhaps maybe this is idealistic, but perhaps we would have a more positive society, for example, or a one that treats each other better and maybe doesn't pursue the destructive side of our nature as much?
Oh, absolutely. As long as, you know, that critical mass is achieved, absolutely. I think we're starting from a very low point though, and
Yeah,
a
there's
lot of change, would need to happen.
a long way to go.
But there's hope. Unfortunately, I think it takes really dramatic events to shake people out of their beliefs and to create a paradigm shift. Well, not necessarily tragic events, but what would be the word? Events that are so perhaps unexpected as to shake existing paradigms, which then obviously results in that paradigm shift.
Right.
So I don't want to be explicit in what I'm actually thinking, but I think it is possible. It doesn't have to be a tragic event. I think as long as it's so fundamental that it's able to shatter belief systems, I think then new paradigms can be developed. Just like
Yeah.
any change, you
Yeah.
need to shatter the existing formulation and then create a new one over it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because my own scientific background has analogies to that with protein structure, energy, and
Ah,
crystal diffraction. You need to overcome sometimes that energy minima to take yourself over that energy hurdle, right? And that's kind of where I see our social landscape. We've kind of slipped down a hill now into this kind of minima. We, like you say, we need some you can phrase it as some high energy event. It doesn't have to be negative necessarily, but some high energy event to pull us back out of that.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it, actually, to change that the existing paradigms
Yeah,
and the
exactly.
way of thinking.
So on that hopefully hopeful note, if we are about out of time, so it has been great chatting with you. Before you
Yeah, I
go, perhaps
enjoyed
you
it.
could let us know if you have any upcoming books in the thought process, as we've discussed, where we might find you online, and if you'll be at any upcoming events or other podcasts or anything you're on.
So I have a Facebook account under my name, but I also have separate pages linked to my profile. So one for my two nonfiction books and one for Circadian Web. So people can message me on a Facebook if they want to be in touch. I've got a couple of events. I do monthly events here in Western Australia for aspiring writers. I run free kind of workshops for people, which is great. So I've been doing that for about a year. So I've got one this weekend. But also, I'm talking at a local writers group about the key things to consider when starting a novel. That's here in Perth. I haven't got any podcasts on the horizon, but I might be looking to. Oh, one of the local libraries is having an event as well early next year where I'm going to be appearing as a local author as well.
So next year being 2026. Oh, that's excellent. So Alistair Conwell, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks, Edwin. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I must admit, I wasn't expecting to go into some of these areas, but I just found it fascinating to do so. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Expect the unexpected on the alternate futures.
Exactly.
All right. And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.